Okay, so we begin this morning in a way in which we begin every presentation on this issue. And this slide is what has happened to our coast since the 1930s. The fact that we have lost over 2,000 square miles of land off of coastal Louisiana. That is the equivalent of losing the size of the state of Delaware. To put that more into a local perspective, 2,000 square miles is the equivalent of losing St. Charles, St. James, St. John, East Baton Rouge, and East Feliciana parishes. And so while this may scare you, this next slide is what should really keep you up at night. And the fact is that if we do nothing over the next 50 years, if we do not implement a single coastal restoration or hurricane protection project across coastal Louisiana, we stand to lose an additional 4,000 square miles of land. To put 4,000 square miles of land into a more local perspective, that is the equivalent of losing the parishes of Point Capee, St. Helena, West Feliciana, Tangipahoa, Washington, Livingston, and St. Tammany parishes. So undoubtedly a very scary scenario for the people that call South Louisiana home. And so the causes of that land loss are due to a variety of factors. Number one, we know that every year we have hurricanes that cross South Louisiana. We are actually tracking a hurricane right now in Cristobal that will be here before we know it sometime over the weekend, and I'll be providing an update on that storm at the end of the presentation. But the land loss is really caused by sea level rise, which can be a hot potato issue in the political realm. But those of you who spend a lot of time in South Louisiana and along our coast, you cannot argue with the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is rising. It continues to encroach upon our communities where our people live and work. Subsidence, which is the natural sinking of land in coastal Louisiana, where our land is literally subsiding across our coast. And then oil and gas infrastructure. While a critical component of our economy, the digging and the dredging of canals and the laying of pipelines and oil and gas exploration has allowed for saltwater intrusion to enter into our fresh estuaries, which has caused for deterioration of our wetlands. But the primary factor of land loss across coastal Louisiana was primarily due to the leveeing of the Mississippi River. Many people don't realize that the Mississippi River literally built the state of Louisiana. After thousands of years of the Mississippi River depositing sediment across our coast, it literally over thousands of years built the land we stand on. And after the flood of 1927, when the federal government leveed the Mississippi River, it cut off that sediment supply and that freshwater supply from continuing to build land on a yearly rate. So a variety of factors are the reasons for why we see land loss across our coast today. But the fact is that it's not just about land loss and environmental and creating habitat and creating wetlands or saving our estuaries. The more land we lose, the more susceptible and the more vulnerable we become as a state to hurricanes and flooding. And so this graph shows that over the next 50 years, if we do not implement a single coastal restoration or hurricane protection project, what the flood depths could be across our coast as a result of a 100-year level of a storm, which was equivalent to the storm such as Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita. So you can see areas across our coast that where a storm would come online to where you could have over 15 feet of storm surge across coastal Louisiana. If you look more up into the capital area around the Lake Maurepas area, you could see even in there, as far up north as the Lake Maurepas, 13 to 15 feet of storm surge would be associated with a 100-year level storm if the state of Louisiana does not take action. And so one of the things that I want to focus on today is a lot of people who call South Louisiana home and who live in the state of Louisiana don't recognize just how important coastal Louisiana and South Louisiana is to the rest of our state, to the entire Gulf Coast region, and to our entire country. 2 million people call South Louisiana home. 20% of the nation's waterborne commerce comes through Louisiana's coast. We have the largest port complex in the world. 5 of the top 15 ports in the country are located in South Louisiana. 26% of the commercial fisheries in the continental United States come from South Louisiana. Our commercial fishing industry ranks 1 or 2, depending on what year you're looking at, in revenue generated from commercial fisheries. And of course, those of you who enjoy duck hunting, we have over 5 million migratory waterfowl that depend on South Louisiana habitat. So it is a critical component for the economic vitality of the Gulf Coast and the entire United States. Off of our coast, there exists literally thousands of miles of pipeline that support the oil and gas industry, that literally fuel this country. 90% of the deepwater oil and gas production in the Gulf of Mexico is serviced out of Port Fourchon. 70% of the oil and gas that comes from the Gulf of Mexico is transported through coastal Louisiana to refineries across our country. If you look at truck cargo flows, the amount of goods and commodities that come from various ports that are transported onto highways and dispersed across areas in other areas across our country. This is a graph that came out of the United States Department of Transportation that shows the truck cargo flows out of the state of New York. Same concept out of Southern California. Same out of Houston. This is a graph that depicts the truck cargo flows that come out of the city of New Orleans alone. If you take into account all of the ports and all of the truck cargo flows that come from South Louisiana, that's what this graph looks like. So it can be argued that South Louisiana literally feeds and fuels this country. The same applies for freight that is transported by water. And if you look at the different major navigation channels across the country, you can undoubtedly see that the Mississippi River is a major corridor for the transportation of goods and commodities to the rest of the country. And so, as I mentioned earlier this year, on April 20th, we had the opportunity to reflect on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. The Deepwater Horizon oil spill was really our aha moment, if you will, and made us realize just how fragile coastal Louisiana is, how important South Louisiana is to the rest of our state. But it also made us realize why we fight so hard within CPRA to restore and protect our coast. And so if I could get to Hag to key up the video, it's a 2 to 3 minute video here that I'd like to share that allows for a little bit of a reflection on the BP oil spill.
2010, 9:45 p.m. 41 miles off Louisiana's coast, the Deepwater Horizon drilling rig is rocked by a sudden violent blowout, killing 11 men on board.
Massive oil spill in the Gulf, which is now 130 miles long, blowing this oil, this sludge,
causing catastrophic damage
into the bayous of southeastern Louisiana.
America has never experienced an event like this before.
In the 87 days that followed, over 200 million gallons of crude oil spilled into the Gulf of Mexico in what's been called the worst environmental disaster in United States history. Tens of thousands of animals died. Water quality degraded, damaging our natural defenses, leaving us more vulnerable to storms and hurricanes. The spill delivered immediate catastrophic impacts to the multi-billion-dollar Gulf fishing and tourism industries. But even as we face the incredible challenge of removing nearly 10 million pounds of oily residue from our shorelines, the people of Louisiana were resilient, and in the early days after the disaster, showed our spirit to begin the long process of recovery. In April 2016, after years of litigation, the court awarded damages to the affected Gulf states, the largest environmental damage settlement in U.S. history. In all, Louisiana is getting the biggest amount for the restoration of our coast, $7.29 billion appropriated through year 2031. And we were ready. Armed with the Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority's Comprehensive Coastal Master Plan, CPRA and our partners began a series of cutting-edge projects to restore and protect what makes this region so special. We're constructing thousands of acres of barrier island beach, dunes, and marsh to defend Louisiana's working coast against hurricanes. We're reconnecting the Mississippi River to its historic Delta region. We've prioritized reestablishing fish and other wildlife habitats, especially those species impacted by the disaster. And billions of dollars in additional projects will set Louisiana's coast on a new trajectory for decades to come. 10 years after Deepwater Horizon, there's a rising tide of hope and optimism on our own horizon. World-class science and engineering are driving protection projects to mitigate the impacts of the spill and make our coast more resilient against future challenges. Preserving our coast requires significant investment over the next several decades, and the lessons we've learned will guide our path forward. Through it all, Louisiana's coastal communities will continue to do what they've always done: adapt, pull together, persevere, because it's our coast and our future.
So one of the things that I want to just make note of is that no matter what the people of South Louisiana are faced with, no matter what, whether it's a hurricane, a natural disaster, an oil spill, a pandemic, our coast and the people who call South Louisiana home will never be a lost cause. And what inspires me every day to go to work on behalf of the people who call South Louisiana home, or just how resilient the people of this state are. And so in the immediate months and days after the BP oil spill, you may ask, how do you address a problem as large in scale as coastal land loss? And how do you address or respond to the largest environmental disaster in our nation's history? And the answer to that question is the state's Coastal Master Plan. Our master plan is our 50-year plan that calls for $50 billion worth of hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects across our coast. The first master plan was developed in 2007. It is updated every 5 years. So the second edition was done in 2012. And then Governor Edwards led the effort for the 2017 Coastal Master Plan. And one of the things that I'm most proud of is that since 2007, every single plan has received unanimous approval by the Louisiana legislature. And if you're familiar with Louisiana politics, you know that it is unheard of to have a $50 billion plan get unanimous approval by elected officials in the state legislature. And I think that really speaks to, number one, the importance of the issue, and number two, the broad bipartisan support that the coastal program continues to enjoy and worked hard over the last several years to achieve. So in total, the Coastal Master Plan is 124 projects. Fully implemented, it would reduce annual flood damages by $150 billion and would create over 802 square miles of land. And so you may remember that when we talked about the fact that we've lost over 2,000 square miles of land since the 1930s, and you may ask, well, why are we only restoring 800 square miles? And the fact of the matter is this, is that we will never have the coast that we had back in the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, or 60s. But we can have a coast that restores a large portion of coastal Louisiana by making sustainable investments in strategic areas across our coast. and investing in projects that will protect the overwhelming majority of people who live across South Louisiana. So the master plan, while $50 billion, $25 billion is spent on coastal restoration projects where we're pumping sediment from offshore to inland through marsh creation projects, where we're spending money through some of the sediment diversion projects, where we're reconnecting the Mississippi River to its coastal marshes, and something I'll touch on a little bit later. But then the other $25 billion is actually what we call the risk reduction or the hurricane protection side of the house, where we're investing in levees and flood walls, pump stations, floodgates, and large-scale hurricane protection systems similar to the one that was built after Hurricane Katrina, around the greater New Orleans area. And so this isn't just a plan that sits on a shelf in Baton Rouge. Since 2007, we've secured over $20 billion with a B for these types of projects. We have secured over 57 million cubic yards of material that has created nearly 50,000 acres of land. We've built or improved over 327 miles of levee and created over 60 miles of barrier islands, which our barrier islands are our first line of defense, a string of barrier islands that really serve as that first speed bump, if you will, when a hurricane is approaching South Louisiana. And so just some before and after pictures of projects that we have implemented over the last several years. This is an area in the Barataria Basin, Landbridge. You can see the before and after there once the vegetation continues to grow. This is an area in Lake Hermitage, which was funded with BP oil spill dollars. And well, I'll just point out these pictures are taken from a helicopter high in the air. You really can't get the full scope and scale of these projects unless you see them in person. And so we spend a lot of time and effort taking members of Congress, congressional delegation staffers out to see these projects so they can see just the scope and scale and how impressive these projects really are. But this is a project that was funded as a result of the BP oil spill settlement. Marsh creation, you can see the before and after there. Bayou DuPont, just in Plaquemines Parish, where we were pumping sediment out of the Mississippi River over 13 miles into Bayou DuPont. Here's a picture of what that area looked like in 2010 and again in 2016. Further southwest, a little bit of a different landscape in southwest Louisiana, where we really focus on shoreline protection, where we're rocking the shoreline there in southwest Louisiana. You can see the yellow line at the bottom portion of the screen there, where we extended the parish shoreline there in Cameron Parish. And then I'll also point out the marsh that is behind that yellow line. So here's a before and an after picture where you can see that beach headland there, which was refurbished through pumping sediment, is also placing rock along that shoreline, as well as the marsh that was refurbished and restored behind that critical highway. I believe that's Highway 82 that cuts across Cameron Parish. Caminada Headlands, to this date, it is the largest restoration project that we have built within CPRA. It is a critical beach headland project that protects one of the most critical economic assets in South Louisiana, Port Fourchon. And you can see this is actually an active construction site when the project was under construction. And what phase one, which is in the near part of the picture here, looks like after construction. And then you can see in the foreground at the top of the picture, which was phase two. This project is now fully completed. It's over 13 miles of beach headland and dune habitat that was refurbished and restored, which will continue to protect Port Fourchon, which again services 90% of the oil and gas in the Gulf of Mexico. You may have seen some recent media reports on a migratory bird habitat, Queen Bess, which is near Grand Isle in Jefferson Parish. This symbolic picture of the brown pelican that was oiled, that was shown all over national media and international media outlets during the spill, was a picture that was taken at Queen Bess Island that experienced significant oiling during the spill, and as a result, further exacerbated many of the factors that were causing its deterioration in that area. And as a result of the BP oil spill settlement, again, we were able to restore over 30 acres, about $18.5 million. And we were very pleased to announce that literally thousands of brown pelican, Louisiana state bird, returned to this island during nesting season. One of the pelicans, which had a pink band on its leg, a pink band symbolizes that it was actually a bird that was oiled during the spill, was brought into a lab, clean, was brought back to health, and then released back into the wild. And there are many pictures on the CPRA Facebook page of the thousands of brown pelicans that are now nesting once again on Queen Bess. As I mentioned, significant investment has been made along our barrier islands against our first line of defense across coastal Louisiana. This is Whiskey Island, just south of Terrebonne Parish. This is a picture taken in 2007. And once again, as we finished its restoration in 2019. So one of the most exciting things about the coastal program right now is that an overwhelming majority of our expenditures are actually going to the construction of hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects. You will see in fiscal year 21, which is when you hear about the legislature passing budgets and looking at fiscal bills and things of that nature, they're talking about fiscal year 21, which is the fiscal year that the state will start on July 1st. Over 74% of our entire budget, $1.08 billion, will be spent on the actual construction of projects. And if you look at over the next 2 years, that percentage continues to increase up to 87% of our entire budget will be spent on the construction of these projects. So it's an exciting time for us in the coastal program to be working on these issues and implementing game-changing projects that will have a lasting impact across coastal Louisiana. So just in the first quarter of this year alone, $147 million of projects were put out for bid. For any of you that are working in the construction industry or the engineering industry, these are major projects. I'm going to talk about some of the economic opportunities and the job creation opportunities that come from this type of investment and these types of projects that are being built across our coast. But again, $147 million worth of projects were put out for bid from January to March of this year. In April of June, the current time period that we're in right now, additional $120 million worth of projects were put out for bid and construction contracts. And things really get kicked into high gear later this summer from July to December, where we have over $850 million worth of construction contracts that are going to be put on the street for restoration and protection projects. And these projects span all the way from Cameron and Calcasieu parishes, all the way across South Central Louisiana into Plaquemine and St. Bernard parishes. Levee projects in Lafitte. I'll point out the Barataria Basin Ridge and Marsh Creation Project, the Spanish Pass, which will be the largest coastal restoration project, the largest marsh creation project we will ever implement in the history of the coastal program, as well as large-scale hurricane protection and coastal restoration projects in Terrebonne and Lafourche parishes. We continue, while we've made significant investments in our barrier islands, we continue over the next several years of making investments in and around the perimeter of our state. Over $160 million for 3 barrier island projects just south of Terrebonne Parish. Trinity, Timbalier, and West Bell Headland will be going to construction in short order. We also continue to focus on protecting South Louisiana residents from hurricanes. Really, the crown jewel of hurricane protection system exists around the greater New Orleans area and the hurricane risk reduction system that was built after Hurricane Katrina, a $14 billion investment that was made around that area as a result of the devastation that occurred during the 2005 hurricane. Recently, we were very pleased to announce, in working with members of our congressional delegation, in securing $760 million for the West Shore Hurricane Protection Project, which will protect the parishes of St. John, St. Charles, and St. James parishes. Additionally, what's very important to note on this slide, that while you see the yellow and red line there that shows the levee alignment that will be built, You also see that darker green area, which is a diversion outfall area. And that diversion outfall area is a result of the Mississippi reintroduction in the Maurepas Swamp, a critical restoration project for that area, which will be built in conjunction with that hurricane protection project. And so we call that integrated coastal protection, when you're restoring the environment through restoration projects, but also building large-scale hurricane protection projects through levees, pump stations, and flood walls as well. And so moving forward, as a result of the BP oil spill funding, over $7.25 billion that will be coming to the state of Louisiana over the next 15 years. Some of the largest restoration projects that will be constructed anywhere in the country will be built right here in South Louisiana. And the Spanish Pass Increment is on the West Bank in Plaquemines Parish, which will restore close to 1,300 acres of marsh and wetlands in that area. Another large-scale Barataria marsh creation project in Plaquemines Parish, another several thousand acres of marsh will be built in that area. Lake Borgne marsh creation project in St. Bernard. It's also important to note that as we continue to work through our way through this pandemic, that we have not had any project interruptions, that the coastal engine continues to churn, and we continue to invest in these projects to restore and protect coastal Louisiana. I do want to spend a little time here when we're talking to the Baton Rouge Rotary, and one of the most exciting things that we have going within the city of Baton Rouge is the water campus, which is housed right here in Baton Rouge, just by the Mississippi River Bridge. If you pass over the Mississippi River Bridge, you can see that beautiful building that was built on the levee. That is actually the Water Institute of the Gulf. But there is a larger water campus where the CPRA is housed, the LSU Center for River Studies, where we have a model of the Mississippi River. And the water campus really serves as a hub of collaboration, where we can bring scientists, engineers, researchers, experts from around the globe right here to Baton Rouge to study the various issues that we face across our coast. And so one of the things that we've come to recognize by working with private sector individuals and academic institutions is the economic impact that coastal restoration and hurricane protection projects have on our economy in this state. So as a result of previous spending years, where our annual budget has been anywhere from $630 million to $840 million, that generates up to $460 to $620 million in wages each year, $1.1 to $1.5 billion in annual output, and $590 to $785 million in value added to the state's economy, which support close to 10,500 jobs each year, with an average wage of about $59,000. So as we see other areas of our economy start to struggle as a result of the pandemic and the decline in oil and gas prices, the water sector, if you will, the restoration and hurricane protection sector on these types of projects continues to thrive, mainly because of the large investments that we're making across our coast. I just want to highlight two projects specifically. I mentioned the two sediment diversion projects that we're building along the Mississippi River, where we're reconnecting the river to its deltaic plain, to the marshes. One project is going to be the Mid-Breton sediment diversion is on the east bank, and the Mid-Barataria sediment diversion on the west bank. These two projects alone, $1.85 billion will be expended by CPRA on construction efforts over the next 7 years. That will result in $3.1 billion increase in sales, $809 million increase in household earnings, and will support over 2,200 jobs per year on average. And that economic forecast was done by a very well-respected economist, Dr. Lauren Scott. And so these are the type of economic opportunities that continue to exist as a result of the work that we're doing within CPRA. I also think it's important to focus on that we're not just focused on the here and now, that we're not just focusing on the projects that we're implementing today and over the next several months. we really are operating with a long-term vision here within the state's coastal program. Earlier this year, the governor announced a series of policy priorities that he will focus on in his next 4 years as governor. And I think it's very important that we continue to build resilience. Resilience has really become a buzzword within this sector. But it's not just about restoring the environment. It's not just about building large-scale hurricane protection projects, but it's also ensuring that our economy is resilient, that we can withstand natural disasters. It's also important that our state government is functioning in a way, in a coordinated fashion, to where DOTD is taking into account information that we have in the Coastal Master Plan and how and where they build roads and bridges, how the Department of Wildlife and Fisheries is issuing oyster leases based upon where we're working and doing our restoration projects across the coast. Another important initiative the governor announced was really a increased focus on the Atchafalaya Basin. Many people who live and work in Baton Rouge spend a lot of time in the basin. And I think it's really one area of our coast that we really don't have our head around. Every other basin of our coast, we know what projects need to be implemented. We know what measures we need to implement to address the issues that we face in those specific areas. But the Atchafalaya Basin, in and of itself, is a tremendous source of sediment. And looking how do you get that sediment out of the basin and transporting it to other areas across our coast is going to be an important effort of ours and an important focus of ours over the next several years. Obviously, I've talked a lot about the seafood industry. When you are implementing restoration projects, you have to keep in mind our seafood industry, particularly the oyster industry, which continues to rely on a certain salinity to harvest oysters. I don't know about you, but I certainly love some Louisiana oysters, and I think it's got to be a goal for ours over the next several years to have a sustainable oyster industry that can coexist with coastal restoration projects moving forward. I think it's also important that we continue to grow, diversify, and protect the economy through coastal investments and coordinated advocacy, and continue to be a hub for innovation and collaboration. So I want to leave you with three parting thoughts, if you will, three takeaways from this presentation. And number one, the issue of hurricane protection and coastal restoration is an existential issue. Too many people that call Louisiana home look at this issue as strictly an environmental and conservation type issue. This is an issue about our survival. This is an issue about our way of life, where you literally, if we do nothing, our state is going to wash away. And if you recall what I said earlier about the economic importance, the importance of coastal Louisiana to the economy across the Gulf Coast, that's why we pay so much attention to this issue. And so while there are countless priorities across state government, from roads and bridges and healthcare and higher education and prisons, you name it, those things are all important. They deserve our attention, but they're worth nothing if they're underwater. And that's why this issue has got to be at the forefront of of state government for years to come. Number two, we are making unprecedented progress in our efforts to restore and protect coastal Louisiana. We have more projects under construction than any other time in the history of our state. If you paid attention to Governor Edwards' inaugural address, over the next 4 years, we will break ground on projects that will ultimately restore more land than we expect to lose. And that is the first time that we can say that since the 1930s. Over $1 billion in expenditures over the next several years will be used to implement some of the largest projects in our history. And number three, it's important to note that we are focused on the long-term sustainability of coastal Louisiana through resilience, through reducing emissions. Up to this point, the state of Louisiana has largely been reacting to the effects of climate change and sea level rise, but has done nothing to address the causes of it. And this can really be a political hot potato, but we enjoy a very good working relationship with the oil and gas sector here in Louisiana, and they will be collaborating with us on how we can reduce emissions over the next several years so that we're addressing the causes of climate change and the causes of the continued degradation across our coast. And then obviously we want to maintain and focus on the economic opportunities that result from our work. So I would ask that you continue to follow our work when it comes to hurricane protection and coastal restoration. We really are all in this together. And I will close with just a quick briefing on Cristobal. We just got off of a briefing with Governor Edwards and the Unified Command Group. We continue to monitor what that storm is going to do. Based upon its current trajectory, it is headed right at us. And so the main concern here within state government is how fast the storm is going to move. Right now, the storm is moving very slowly. And when you have a storm that moves that slowly, obviously the concern will be the amount of rainfall that is going to be dumped in areas across South Louisiana. And so we have tested all of our hurricane protection systems in coordination with the federal government and local levee districts. We are prepared, but it's important for everybody in the state of Louisiana to get a game plan, that you have a plan on what you and your family will do in the event of a hurricane. And so again, I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today, and I will be happy to take any questions from the audience.
Okay, so we have several questions. First one from Matt Lynch. How are we collaborating with scientists in the Netherlands for these projects, and are we learning from them?
So excellent question. So I think when it comes to other areas across the globe on being leading experts on this issue, on how do you live on a delta, restore a delta, live with water, manage water, I think you don't have to look any further to the Dutch. They have experienced some significant devastation as a result of storms and natural disasters in that area. I have been over there and met with the officials from that area and kind of how they are using nature and the natural processes from sediment to restore their coastline and their portions of their country that continue to remain vulnerable to hurricanes and storms and degradation to the environment. I will also say that the Water Institute of the Gulf is really a concept that was developed as a result of going over to meet with the Dutch. Del Torres is the leading expert when it comes to these issues, and the Water Institute of the Gulf was really formed to mimic that entity over in the Netherlands that serves as that hub of collaboration and scientific information, which helps inform the government on where and how to make investments. So we have actually signed a memorandum of understanding with Del Torres, and we continue to collaborate with the Dutch government on how we can learn from one another. They continue to send individuals over here to be housed at the Water Institute. And so there's extensive collaboration that not only takes place there, but with other leading experts across the globe when it comes to this issue.
Okay, so the next question comes from Marvin Borgmeyer. It's a two-part question. If $7 billion comes from BP, where does the rest of the $50 billion come from? And also, how are the projects prioritized?
Sure, excellent question. So the overwhelming majority of our funds do come from the BP oil spill. We do receive an annual allocation from state government, from state mineral revenues, from revenues that are generated on state land, state water bottom oil and gas production. That is only about $15 to $25 million per year. Another large portion of our revenue comes from the federal government through what we call the Gulf of Mexico Energy Security Act, from oil and gas production off of our outer continental shelf, where the federal government shares 37.5% of revenues generated from oil and gas production with the 4 Gulf producing states. So last year we got about $140 million as a result of the GoMesa revenue stream. the last 2 years, we have received an annual allocation from surplus here in the state of Louisiana that was realized from a previous fiscal year. And so while we don't have $50 billion sitting in the Coastal Trust Fund, and we have not identified the full allocation of $50 billion, we don't need all $50 billion today. We need to, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint, and we need to stay on track over a 50-year planning horizon to do about $1 billion worth of work a year. And so this year we have $1 billion worth of expenditures as a result of the various funding streams that I just outlined. But it's also important to note that when the BP oil spill dollars dry up, which will be in 2032, they're paid out over 15 years, we have to figure out where we're going to make up that loss in revenue from. And that's why you see us spending a tremendous amount of time in Washington, D.C., meeting with members of Congress on how we're using the revenues from the federal government that are shared with the Gulf states, on how we're being responsible in investing those dollars back into the coast. Number one, sustaining the infrastructure that allows for that production to take place to begin with, but then also showing the federal government how we're investing those dollars in hurricane protection projects that protect the citizens from hurricanes and storms. And when you're not making proactive investments like that, and you're waiting on natural disasters and hurricanes to occur without making those investments, you're going to spend exponentially more money responding those disasters rather than making those, if you would have made those proactive investments on the front end. And so, again, we don't have all $50 billion identified, but over the next 15 years, we have identified close to $18 billion that will be sustaining this agency and this effort over the next several years.
Which that's kind of parlays into Steve Webb's question. The investment in these projects is impressive. What is the sustainability of the project results, and what assurances do we have that the next hurricane doesn't destroy the efforts that we've already accomplished?
So excellent question. So anytime that we are engineering or designing these types of projects, we want to ensure that we are taking all environmental scenarios into account. We want to take the rate of subsidence into account. We want to take the rate of sea level rise into account, to where we're talking about how high or what elevation these projects are being built at. And so when we construct these projects, we are looking at a long-term scientific information data that is given to us from various researcher institutions and academic institutions, including the Water Institute of the Gulf, to make sure that we are taking into account all of the environmental scenarios to ensure that these projects are sustainable. So, for example, a marsh creation project where we're pumping sediment out of the Mississippi River or pumping sediment from offshore into our marshes. The lifespan of that project is anywhere from 25 to 30 years. However, as a result of the diversion projects where we are reconnecting the Mississippi River, not only are you building new land by mimicking that natural process, you're also helping to sustain the land that you're building through other delivery mechanisms like marsh creation, where you're dredging and pumping that sediment. So when you take the Mississippi River and the diversions and you're sustaining those projects, you extend the lifespan of those projects to probably 50 to 55 years. But it's also important for the public to know that this isn't just a one and done. You're not going to have $50 billion invested in South Louisiana, and then we can all walk away and go home. There is always going to be a continual effort to restore and protect coastal Louisiana. And so we are in this for the long haul, but I can tell you that we are making strategic investments. We are making investments that are sustainable, that restore the overwhelming majority of coastal Louisiana and protect the citizens of our state.
David Culpepper had a statement. He said all of CPRA's projects in total will result in the largest coastal restoration effort in world history. That
is true. That is true. I'm not aware of any other restoration program that are implementing the types of projects that we're implementing, nor at the scale or capacity that we are doing. We are literally, in my opinion, leading the world. I think while the Dutch have a little bit more experience in gathering the scientific information, but I think from an implementation standpoint and actually addressing the issues and implementing solutions to the problems we face, I think we are undoubtedly leading the world on that front.
One last question from Richard. He said, Chip, you've given us an outstanding presentation. Please tell us what led you to this line of work, and thank you for your great service to our state.
Well, thank you for that. What really led me to this line of work was I graduated from LSU in 2003, and immediately upon graduating, I got a job on Capitol Hill, where I was working on various federal policy issues. And I was in Washington, D.C. when Hurricane Katrina hit. And my wife, Emily, and I, we got married in August of 2005, and Hurricane Katrina hit at the end of August. And so watching the devastation that unfolded on national media outlets and what I was witnessing sitting in Washington, D.C., I knew that when I moved back home, that's something I wanted to be a part of, because I knew that our way of life, the whole way in which the state of Louisiana and state government approached hurricane preparedness was going to change. And it was going to be a massive, massive undertaking at the federal and state level for us to restructure the way in which we approach this issue. And so luckily enough, we moved back home in 2008, and I immediately made an effort to get on then Governor Bobby Jindal's transition team, where I began working with then Garrett Graves, who's now Congressman Garrett Graves, on the transition team on identifying policy issues that we needed to pursue as a state to further stand up the coastal program. And so I have been with the coastal program since 2008 and have been working tirelessly every day since. And so that's really how I came into the fold, was working on federal policy issues. I got to know Congressman Graves and have managed to stay on board through multiple gubernatorial administrations. And it's, in my opinion, it's one of the greatest issues to be working on, because I have the opportunity to really interact and engage with every single stakeholder group and interest group that you can imagine in the state of Louisiana, because this is an issue that affects all of us.
Chip, thank you so much for sharing CPRA's great progress in trying to protect us from the elements, if you will, keeping it that simple. We really appreciate it. Excellent presentation. We were very excited to have you join us and share that great information with us.